Okay, I've been doing a couple of tactical games recently that, in particular, very, one-to-one type tactical in the sense of dogfighting in Blue Max, spaceship to spaceship combat in Talon. And it brought up something that I've often thought about, often debated about, done so sometimes publicly, sometimes not so much, which is the exploration and exposition of the reasoning for formations. um, so, I guess the thinking first kind of came to my mind when I was first starting to play role-playing games, because all the military games that I played prior to that were, units were formations. They were already formed things. You don't really worry too much about that. Now, there's some aspects like gaps between formations and stuff like that that shows up in tactical gunpowder era games, and I'll get. There is one exception, or one set of exceptions, where I think formation does kind of show something, at least at a very small scale, on ground warfare. But let me leave that in. Obviously, tanks would be similar to the planes, etc. But the thing that I first started thinking about was the concept of, look, when you have a field, when you have a system that says, like D&D did, and like most role-playing games do, that says you have an ability to defend against certain weapons with certain, other weapons or whatever in terms of parrying, you have an ability to inflict damage based on some things. They never take into effect the context of, at least that I'm aware of, Chivalry and Sorcery might. It's been so long since I looked at that. But most of them that I looked at don't take into effect the context of, I got somebody right on my left and somebody right on my right. Now, that's sensible in kind of a dungeon crawl type situation. But honestly, if you want to truly understand, when you're fighting a pack of orcs, well, if they're all swinging swords and have a certain spacing between them that's different from a bunch of spear orcs who are, thrusting at you and providing you with sort of a pincushion of problems, that should be representable even in the dungeon crawl type situation. There are going to be situations where you're fighting organizable enemies as opposed to unorganized mobs, where there's some military discipline, and that should show even in a role-playing game. All right, so that's kind of the first, and a similar thing came up much later in my life. I'm sure I thought of examples otherwise, but much later in my life when I was playing Mount and Blade, which is supposed to represent military combat, and we argued with the designer and begged and pleaded for him to throw formations, and eventually he did, but he didn't throw them in quite the way that I would like. He didn't show that, look, spearmen just don't work on their own anywhere near the same way that they operate when they're operating as, kind of like a phalanx or something like that. And in fact, you couldn't have somebody carrying a pike and being at all effective on their own. It's a useless weapon unless it's part of that formation. And that should be expressed in any games type situation. What he did was incorporated formations so that they operated for movement, and that probably made 90% of the people who wanted formations happy, because what they didn't get was why it was important to the rest of us, why formation should be there. And it's completely an alien thought to them, which is an examination of the actual effects of formations on the military combat. So let me get back to the one example, with something like Squad Leader, for example, where you have very, very one-to-one tactical operation, one-to-one figure. Squad Leader is a little less than one-to-one, or a little more than one-to-one. Ambush would be an example. But squad leader it applies too, where you come up with certain patterns of how to advance, etc. And even in Panzer Blitz and things like that, you have this, where you want to position certain units in certain places to protect your advance forward. And it just becomes this pattern as to how you're going to advance. And maybe formation is not exactly the right word because it doesn't really apply to these types of units. These aren't like, gunpowder regiments or phalanxes or anything like that, where the weapons are absolutely dependent upon, another person standing next to you, in order to get the effect that you need. And obviously skirmishers are the counterexample to formation, or the effects of formation being explored make it interesting to see the advantages of skirmishers versus the advantage of a line unit. Just to put that into the context. This is all very interesting stuff to look at in the one-to-one scale. And in terms of, say, ambush, or in terms of any, even in squad leader, the idea of I'm dispositioning someone here, and then I have this pattern of moving forward, and now terrain disrupts my pattern. How do I cope with that? That adds all kind of interesting kind of doctrinal ideas that focus around something that's similar to, but not quite the same as formation. In air combat, it's a different sort of thing. There, the attachment of a wingman is more or less just another set of eyes watching you. It's like traveling with a buddy through the jungle, so that you're less likely to both be surprised. It's very easy for one person to be surprised. It's much, much harder, I think, for two people who are paying attention on different levels, at different locations, peeking, looking in different directions, etc., to get the drop head on them, and then one can give the warning. And that I think is kind of the idea of the wingman type situation. You can also support your wingman. You're trying to keep him alive, so it doesn't turn out to be just the pairing off of planes versus planes. By adding that aspect, it's sort of almost a pseudo formation. It's something that'll help. You have formations, obviously, in the naval combat games. And here is one of the few places where they really, really show out nicely. Is something like Flying Colors, where the command effects of formations are in play here. Okay, I can move a certain number of ships kind of at will, and that's unrealistic as hell. But let's just say, I can give new orders to ships kind of at will, or I can give orders to a large line. And if my formation breaks up, I'm going to have a harder time commanding it. And there are certain formations and doctrines that allow you to operate effectively, not just in terms of, line ahead or whatever. The point is that line ahead says, that keeps you in a position where you can move forward and then actually charge in a reasonable disposition all at once. So, as long in order to one of the affecting principles of formations is the bunching together so everybody does the same thing, as opposed to the skirmisher where everybody's loose and can make good decisions on their own. Well, if you want to move men into a position to do a specific task, you want to keep them organized and you want to keep them kind of close together. And different eras, different effects there. But in terms of, in terms of the age of sail ships, a straight line ahead makes sense, but you don't necessarily want to engage in that. That's like a march column. What you'd really rather do, although you do sometimes do two lines passing by, is more of a Nelsonian, everybody turns and moves in a coordinated fashion. And which of these doctrines are practiced, how well they're practiced, all kinds of stuff like that should come into effect in terms of how successfully you can pull off the formation itself, the doctrine, whatever you want to say. Now, what I'm playing right now is Talon, and like SFB, it has no real concept of formation. The idea here is all your ships are kind of in constant communication, so it's not unreasonable, like World War II ships, to say, hey, they can make their decisions in real time. But here's the problem with both games, is that at least objective time, the subjective time that the person in the ship is there to make a decision is actually really, really small. And unless this is all coordinated supercomputers using light-speed transmissions, or better than light-speed transmissions, to communicate and coordinate their functionality, you are not going to be able to control all of your pieces in quite the same way that, you would say squad-level combat in World War II would make sense to have sort of a certain degree of control over people, more or less line of sight. But beyond that, you're starting to strain credulity, but whatever. It gives a situation that's much, much closer to that of the aircraft. So aircraft combat, and especially, as you get faster and faster, the dogfights really do become something that's just more swirling around individually fighting in a way that does, and you're trying to get your attack of opportunity, etc. And do the games show that? Well, to some extent they do, because you have free, access to everything. It would be better if there was no coordination whatsoever between individual items, or very little coordination, in the same way that Blue Max has, or that other air-to-air combat games have, where you maybe have a moment to speak a word or three to the people near you that indicates maybe more detailed information, but you're not deeply discussing the ramifications and considering them all. In fact, the actual flying of the ship should, given the time span in which the decisions are made, should be very strictly time constrained as well. Of course, the argument could be made that that's all computerized and that optimal solutions are being are being determined. But you know what? If you're doing that, you shouldn't, as a player, be making any decisions really beyond some very, very broad sort of programming decisions as to seek out the weakest enemy and hit them, or you could say there's much, much more complex programming, but as a player, you're now playing the computer programming across the board or something. I don't know. It feels a little weird in that case. So, but the decision cycle is just too tight for someone to be taking into account all the information that's available to them. And of course, then if you do start putting time limits on people, you may get less well-considered decisions, and this is true in the air games as well, but the thing that kind of becomes the determinant as to how well you play is actually how well you know the rules and what little things you have absorbed in your head, so that they all filter into your decision making. So you're not surprised, in terms of Talon, it's very, very easy, the choices that you have on... I'm not actually playing yet, so... The choices that you have on the AP choices that you can make in a given turn or whatever, that becomes something that, if you don't have that fully internalized, now you're going to have more trouble ever coming to one of those decisions, just because it might not be at the top of your head when you look at it. Now, there's one other thing about formation that in particular about Talon got me thinking about this again, which was the decision to not have 3D. Even in something like Blue Max, the third dimension is pretty damn necessary. It may not add a lot to the game, but clearly in air combat, you can drop down and get out of the combat unless somebody comes chasing you, right? And then once they come chasing you, they're kind of out of the rest of the combat. So you can kind of, you can peel off and make your opponent make a decision of whether to follow you or not. Well, that same kind of circumstance would apply to the dogfighting type situation here. But one of the things, what was the game? Double Star, I think it was, GDW, that I played just a couple of years ago, which presented the idea of different formations and how they are able to deal their attacks on people. And this is something that really intrigues me about fleet combat in space, because the formations that you choose in, I don't know, say World War I or earlier naval combat, they were more or less fixed by the technologies that humanity had available to them. If you had certain, and technologies were pretty much linear, you move basically the optimal solutions for the level of technological understanding were easily found. And different nations may have come up with different innovations that helped them for a brief period of time, but then those innovations would spread if they were actually useful, and everybody would have more or less the same technology across the board. The concept of space combat, where you might have wildly divergent technologies facing each other, brings into mind the idea that very, very different formations might exist. Now, once two cultures strike each other and start fighting, very quickly they're going to start trying to decipher each other's technologies. And if one actually is better than the other in general, and of course games try to balance them all out, right? But if one technology is better than the other in general, or serves purposes that are necessary, I think you're going to find the spread of those technologies. So for example, if drones are good, everybody's going to have drones eventually, in the SFB sense. Or if missiles are good, everybody's going to have missiles eventually. So the time span of the game, which allows of the Grand Campaign in Talon, which allows the creation of new ships, etc., is such that there should be technology in that. Now, the reason, and transfer of technology. I understand why there isn't, and you have the option of increasing and improving technology showing up in SE4X, which can be used as a campaign backdrop for Talon battles, but instead of using their homemade one. But neither one addresses the concept of technology spreading from one race to the other. And that's actually, I think, a very important thing. Now, some of that has to do with the simple fact that Talon just comes with certain fixed ships. And SFB had this same problem. And when the original SFB games came out, they had, oh look, the Federation has these weapons, the Klingons have these, the Gorns have these, and never should they meet. And then later, as the game began to mutate into something much more like World War II naval combat, you started seeing the concept of the spread of technology being applied a little bit more, so that everybody acquired at least limited numbers or limited capability to use other people's technology for special cases maybe or whatever. Anyway, this is getting far from where I wanted to go with this. But one of the things is the particular weapon systems that you choose and have available to you are going to affect the particular formations that you devise and how they operate. And when you have mixed weapon systems in a fleet, you might be more willing to kind of experiment with new types of formations that will work. Now, to really experiment with these formations, is a sphere more sensible than a cone? You know, what do you want your formation to look like and why? You really need to be able to display them on this extreme tactical level that a game like Talon provides for you. However, since it doesn't work in 3D, it loses that capability, that exploration element. To some extent, you can capture a hint of it through the two-dimensional combat, but here's the thing. If a sphere is a good, let's say a circle facing all outward is a good design. A sphere is not necessarily as good a design, even though it provides the same elements, for the simple fact that, first of all, your engines in both cases are kind of not necessarily facing the right way. But that's covered. It's actually the number of ships required to even make a sphere is so much higher than the number to create a circle, which means you get all the advantages of a sphere in a two-dimensional game with a lot less ships, and that's disturbing. Now, is a sphere a good design? Well, it could be in certain circumstances, certain speeds, certain weapons, whatever. Maybe it makes sense. It all depends on how the particular weapon systems interact and what they do, and that's where different formations are going to develop out of and make decisions of. And it would just be nice to see a game, and I have not seen one yet, where you can really explore that. Now, obviously, with something like Attack Vector, you have every opportunity to examine all of that. Unfortunately, that's a game in which there's so much detail present that it's hard to just fly one ship without and go where you're trying to go, rather than, at least for me, rather than something kind of abstract like this. And I'm not sure it's possible. If you start adding things like 3D, like vector movement, well, you've gotten to a complexity level where the game is no longer really playable enough to handle fleet combats. Anyway, those are just some thunks upon the idea. I mean, it's like nobody does man-to-man phalanx combat for a reason. But when you're dealing with large, expensive objects like ships, I feel like some degree of formation is worth examining to see how they operate, and to try to come up with the reasons that something like the first of the Lensman book, those different formations evolving with different weapons types, end up coming out. Why do they work that way? Why would you explore that? Now, maybe you can do it better in computers games rather than on board games, where there's a lot more capability to keep track of things. Another advantage, like with the sailing ships of old, is it could be that a formation can move together in pattern in a better way. And that pattern can be quite complex. You're not limited to the kinds of patterns that sailing ships have. You could have something where the pattern is there's a front line of ships that constantly is falling back and being replenished, sort of like the gunfire patterns that happened, on advances in gunpowder era. But, you could just have really, really super complex patterns. But the fact that it's a pattern actually is kind of important, because that's something that you don't have to constantly be making decisions, as in a dogfight, of, hey, what's my best move right now? It's, I just follow my pattern, my dogma, and it should work for the weapons I have against the weapons my enemy has. again, totally pre-programmed type stuff, and I'm not sure how much fun that is to play out. It might be more fun, more of something for the computer again. Anyway, some thoughts on it. I don't know how valuable it is to anybody. I don't know where it might go, but there you have it.